opponents, you ready? Go ahead. Judge. All right. We negate resolve. Countries of the world should accept substantially more refugees from the Middle East. Observation 1. Since long-term conflict is the primary cause of the refugee crisis, this round ought to be determined by which team best prevents long-term conflict from escalating or existing in the future. Contention 1 is an abandonment of society. The majority of refugees being accepted are upper-middle-class educated professionals. McHugh in 15 explains. Recent figures from the UN have shown that the majority of people arriving in Europe come from upper-middle-class, well-educated backgrounds. This means that conflicted Middle Eastern countries are losing a large amount of doctors, lawyers, engineers, and other educated professionals. Plans to rebuild Syria are taking place right now. Educated and professional Syrians need to stay in the Middle East in order for it to have a future. A project called The Future of Syria has brought together teams of development experts. The project aims to create a post-war planning option. Syria's recovery will depend on whether its industrial powerhouse can bounce back. Instead, we should help Syria in rebuilding their society in the form of developmental aid. Cameron in 16 explains. It means redoubling our efforts to begin planning for the stabilization effort that will be needed to support the Syrian people in the rebuilding of their country. Refugee acceptance does nothing to solve the underlying issue, it just means violence reproduces itself. Pollock in 16 explains. In places racked by civil war, ISIS is finding new recruits and new sanctuaries, but where order prevails, they dissipate. When the United States brought stability in 2007 to Iraq, Al-Qaeda was pushed to extinction, only to find salvation in 2011 when civil war broke out in Syria. Without people in the country actively opposing the government and trying to reform, there's no chance for the future of a stable government, meaning the conflict will only continue. Contention 2 is a political backlash. Subpoint A is the right of nationalism. European right-wing parties are gaining power through the promotion of anti-refugee stances. Robbins early in 15 explains. Poland elected one of Europe's most right-wing parliaments this weekend, joining anti-immigration parties across Europe that have seen significant gains in the last year. The European right-wing governments already in power are capitalizing on nationalist sentiment and promoting anti-immigration policies. These parties capitalize off the current refugee crisis. Robbins early continues. As thousands of people flee from conflict zones, far-right parties speak to voters' fears of what the influx will mean for their nations. Subpoint B, Europe's right is trying to oppress refugees. Countries enact harsh policies that discriminate against refugees. Gerber in 16 explains. A new law allows Danish authorities to confiscate migrants' assets over $1,500 to help cover the cost and care and mandates a 3-year wait before refugees can send for family members. European countries are currently enacting harsh far-right policies that make refugee life futile in Europe. Hume in 16 explains. Austria has passed controversial new laws that would allow authorities to turn away migrants at the border. The UN Secretary General was concerned that countries are adopting increasingly restrictive immigration and refugee policies. Under current governments, European countries are perpetuating significant discrimination and exclusion for migrants and refugees. Karnikova in 16 explains. Denmark's recent tightening of laws affecting immigrants have become tighter. When you live in a society that constantly makes it harder to get, for example, citizenship, then there are more cases that are being appealed. The current government does not seem to give the fight against discrimination any attention or priority at all. Subpoint C, power from the right leads to more radicalization. Schrem and Hendrickson 16 explain. Muslim ghettos in Paris and Brussels are incubators of Islamic extremism where crime and unemployment are rampant and radicals recruit young men. Perpetrators of the attack on Paris hailed from a Brussels slum that has long been a hotbed for radical Islam. The brothers who carried out the Charlie Hebdo massacre in January 2015 lived in the suburbs of Paris, desolate, rundown neighborhoods built 50 years ago to house waves of immigrants. These poor neighborhoods in which they live act as breeding grounds for terrorism because many of these people feel as if they have no other options or hope. Residents of these communities have been linked to nearly all of Belgium's terrorism incidents in recent years. These slums are isolated from the rest of society and their governments offer no help. These people, hopeless and frustrated, turn to radical groups who claim to offer help. When a right-wing government who has no regard for the life of refugees gains power, this means that the trend will only continue and promote anti-refugee policies. Any refugee, quote-unquote, integrated into their societies will only be forced to settle in these satellite slums, leaving more room for radicalization. Thus, unigate.
All right. Since we're not doing the podium again, I'll just say here. All right, Carlos, are you good? Kingwood GS.
Whenever you're ready.
And most importantly, Judge. All right, sounds good. Hendrickson affirms the resolution. Contention 1 is smuggling. Millions of refugees have used life-threatening pathways to leave the Middle East. Michael Birnbaum from the Washington Post explains, due to the lucrative business of smugglers and reduced cost of refugees, 90% of refugees reach their territory via smugglers to ease at least a part of their trip. Anna Shea of Amnesty International explains, inadequate government action is the chief cause of smuggling and trafficking. When people are desperate, nothing will stop them from leaving. François Crapeau of the UN corroborates the restrictive border policies of the EU create the business of smuggling. Fortunately, the European Council on Refugees explains we could put smugglers out of business immediately if the EU would create legal channels for refugees to reach Europe. The reason is simple. If countries accept more refugees, these new legal channels can supplement the illegal channels of smugglers. The UN corroborates, without a regular alternative available to reach safety, people will continue to pay smugglers and risk their lives through dangerous journeys. Eliminating smugglers brings three key benefits. A. Reducing funding for terrorism. Viviane Wall from Time explains, the movement of migrants across the Middle East towards Europe has generated $323 million for the Islamic State. And tackling smuggling can not only protect refugees, but play a part in reducing violence. The RAND Corporation corroborates. Countering ISIS demands operations that shut down sources of finance. B is reducing human trafficking. The International Business Times writes, refugees tell horror stories about being sexually assaulted, ransomed, and often sold into slavery. The economies of smuggling is the catalyst driver that leads to the death of migrants. The Gatestone Institute for International Policy laments, Syrian girls are the ones who suffer the most. Creating these new channels can help reduce the availability of these traffickers. And finally, C is saving lives. Nick Robbins in September explains traffickers often replace proper transport with overloaded, rickety boats that frequently capsize or leave people stranded and use cramped trucks in which refugees can suffocate to death. Some travelers even face violent armed robberies while at sea. Without legal channels, people will continue to travel through these perilous routes. Robbins explains, in 2015 alone, more than 381,000 people attempted to enter Europe by sea. This is uniquely problematic because the International Migration Organization writes, nearly 70% of deaths recorded refer to migrants who are missing, mainly at sea. In the world of con, smuggling will only grow. Strict border policies create this problem, and Nick Robbins contextualizes, Europe is trying to solve the very problem through even stricter borders. Constitution 2 is seizing camps. When Nadia Soudani was growing up in Lebanon, she used to wear beautiful textiles made in Syria. Now, she is a humanitarian medical aide who finds it surreal to see Syrian mothers wrapping babies in plastic. This is one of 1,000 horror stories as a result of Syrian refugee camps. Alexander Betts, in his book Refugees and International Relations, explains, an increasing number of host states respond to refugee situations by pursuing policies of containing refugees in isolated and insecure camps. Specifically for refugees, journalist Anne Lum highlights the conditions of the camps are simply utterly inhumane. This is a regional problem because the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace laments. Long-term refugee camps come with social and security challenges that plague host countries. However, accepting refugees into the countries and removing them from camps can bring three benefits. A. Stopping sexual assault. Phoebe Greenwood from The Guardian reports in sprawling camps, aid workers report a soaring number of incidents of domestic violence and rampant sexual exploitation. B is reducing disease. Anne Lum again explains because the country's infrastructure has been steadily destroyed, it's been impossible to get vaccinations to the country or risk one's life. As a result, she concludes chronic diseases like diabetes are unlikely to get medication, and no immunizations mean increasing likelihood of infectious diseases spreading, which is problematic when camp conditions are so tightly packed and horrendous. And finally, C is reducing recruitment. Grandma Baydon from Arizona State University writes, the circumstances in camps breed conflict and act as a catalyst for refugee, radical, militant groups. In order to prevent terror, we must remove the camps. And for these reasons, Carlos and I are very proud to affirm. You can take the first question on every shoulder.
Okay, so why does opening up legal channels eliminate refugee camps?
Okay, so that's not the link.
Then how do you link to losing camps? Because your advocacy is legal channels,
yes.
Right? So if you don't
No. My advocacy as the affirmative is to accept refugees. What we define accepting refugees is two key things. First, it's opening legal channels, and secondly, it's removing the camps.
Okay, what's the probability of legal channels being open in the future? Is that going to happen?
I'll respond to two things. One, as the affirmative, we have permission to fiat that this would happen.
You can't fiat political mindsets.
I would say if the resolution is questioned, should countries of the world substantially accept refugees? I would say yes.
Why does the politics dissad exist if you can fiat political mindsets?
The politics dissad is made so we can win a debate round. However, that doesn't even make sense in public forum debate because this is about the resolution. Should we accept refugees? We can fiat. But
we say no, you shouldn't because refugees, A, will be turned away, and B, they will get discriminated against.
There's a second reason why we don't just get there's beyond the fiat. The second reason is we're changing the paradigm. So what we're telling is countries like Hungary and like Austria and like Turkey who have fences, when we affirm, we're changing the paradigm. They're removing those fences, they're letting the refugees in, and that's what's happening. We're shifting the paradigm.
That's
the
not going
realistic
to happen.
answer.
Austria literally closed their borders 2 days ago to the current refugee flow. If you put more refugees into Europe, Austria is going to continue to turn these people away. You're not going to see people going through Austria. It's not going to happen.
And what's your question?
I was like answering what you
Okay.
said. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. So, and this is a series of questions, just yes or no real quick. First contention, do you mention wealthy refugees leaving?
Yeah, that's the...
So your second contention, then you mention poor refugees going ghettos, yes?
No, I say refugees are relegated to ghettos because of discriminatory policies in Europe when they get there.
So
then they become poor because they're discriminated against by the communities they're in.
Wait, why would a doctor suddenly become poor? I think a doctor can find employment.
Because a doctor
in
in Syria that goes into Europe and is relegated to a slum, that's the only place he can live. He can't practice in this slum because like there's no way to do that. He can't go to a hospital and say, hey, give me a job, I'm a doctor, because he lives in a slum and he's discriminated against by everyone in the country he goes to.
And the final question is, you mentioned a satellite slum. Yeah. Last time, my definition of satellite means outside. So does this mean outside the country?
Okay, satellite slums just like a term to describe like the Arab slums in these European countries. So
what does satellite mean?
They have satellites on all the buildings because they need to get like Arab television and Arab radio. That's why they're called satellite slums.
I don't think that's true, but I'll see evidence later.
I mean, that was even in an analytic. That wasn't in evidence. That's why we call it a satellite slum. Okay, yeah. So in the AF world, will not more refugees just go into camps? Because isn't that how we accept refugees in the status quo?
So, again, this is answering a question from earlier. We're shifting the paradigm when you affirm.
What does that even mean? What does
mean?
shifting the paradigm mean? You said that like 8 times, and I'm still not sure what you're trying to get at here.
What basically, okay, I'm saying to explain. So, when we shift the paradigm, when you affirm, when you're saying we should accept more refugees, we're not only we're opening the borders. That's step 1. Step 2 is we let the refugees in, and most of the time refugees can travel through any country. Let's say go through Turkey because of Germany. But the point of the matter is, asylum is the answer to shifting the paradigm.
Cool. All right, we're gonna wrap up.
Yeah, just a little bit. A minute 11. Okay, first of all, I'm a little sick, so if I start getting unclear, just say clear. So I'm just going to be starting with, just at the top of, I'm just going to go down the row, honestly. Is everyone ready? The first voting issue in the round that you can crystallize right now is that the pro is clearly not topical. There's a reason for this, because acceptance by UNHCR, which is the leading organization for refugees, just means that you have to provide resettlement, which means legal or physical protection. That means that there are refugee camps in Europe right now, and those refugees are seen as being accepted as refugees. So when they say that we're going to take refugees out of camps, that is not acceptance. That would be seen as integration. They're not actually increasing the substantial acceptance. Their other advocacy is by opening up legal channels, but this is not countries actually going out and accepting more refugees, which means providing legal and physical protection. It only means opening up legal channels to maybe subsidize more flows of refugees. That means right off the top, they're not meeting what the resolution asked them to meet, and you can down them right now. First on the contention, what? On the contention 1, human trafficking still occurs in refugee camps. Tandem 15 explains these camps, characterized by high population density, internal and external security concerns, and endemic resource shortages, are an ideal location for traffickers to prey on potential victims. I'll do more work with this evidence when I talk about how even if we do accept substantially more refugees, they're only going to go to the camps, and that only supercharges the human trafficking impact. Furthermore, smugglers are often disguised as fishermen, and what it basically means is impossible to eradicate the problem. Kingsley in 15 explains, therein lies the problem. Smuggling boats start life as fishing trawlers. The moment of transition from the latter to the former is informal and almost imperceptible to outsiders. Smugglers do not maintain a separate independent harbor of clearly marked vessels ready to be targeted by EU airstrikes. They buy them off fishermen at a few days' notice, and the need for smuggling will never end. Kingsley 15 explains, the government won't help, the UNHCR won't help, the only option is to go to the smugglers. It's simply not going to stop. The borders are open and there's always going to be an appetite for it. What this means is that is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and simply opening up legal channels does not, and opening up borders does not mean that smuggling will end. It's something like a $26 billion industry. I looked it up in an earlier round. I don't remember anymore. Now, you can turn their thing about restrictive border policies. Look at the fact that literally 3 days ago, by taking in just a small influx of refugees, Austria actually closed down its borders and says that they're going to start closing away migrants. Now, before they come up here and say that we can fiat this, we are actually showing that the only answer to this is like this vague change the paradigm. But we're showing a larger macro political trend all across Europe. France, Denmark, Austria, Belgium, Hungary, Greece, and in Sweden in 2014, a white supremacist party had set a record seats in parliament simply by saying we don't want to accept more refugees. What this means is it leads to more oppression and more discrimination of refugees. So even if you buy the entirety of the pro that we're going to pull them out of refugee camps, we're going to open up the borders, they're still relegated to slums, they're still relegated to oppression and discrimination. Move on to their contention 2 about camps. First of all, they still go to camps, and these camps in Germany, for example, have just as bad conditions. Bender from the Wall Street Journal says that 37,000 people voluntarily left refugee camps in Germany and throughout Europe, actually specifically in Germany, so that it would be even more if you take in all of Europe, voluntarily left camps to go back to Syria because they would rather be at threat of death in a civil war than be relegated to the awful conditions that you see in refugee camps. So even if we start accepting substantially more refugees, which the pro-advocacy is still not advocating for, but say you buy that it does and we open up legal channels, they're just going to be put in refugee camps in Europe, and you need to buy that this is what happens in the status quo. When you accept refugees, they're usually just sent in a crowd of refugee camps. But say that they do come out of the refugee camps, extend our Schramm's and Frederick 16 card, our Hume 16 card, our Karnakovo 16 card, and our Gerbery 16 card, that they will just be relegated to these satellite slums. And what this means is that they're actually going to be facing as same or worse conditions than what they face in Syria. For example, they sometimes even seize their property. And look to the fact that these slums are what actually create terrorism. The 3 major terrorist attacks in Europe over the past 2 years have become from these satellite slums, as well as almost all of Belgium's terror activity resulted as a result of these relegated Muslim slums.
Okay. Can I see the Ruth Bender evidence?
Yeah, sure. It's actually an article. I'll just pull it up for you.
That's the satellite slums evidence, right?
No,
That's the
That's
refugee.
37,000.
We also get that evidence as well.
Hold on. What do you?
Where we talk about slums, like refugees in slums.
Okay. That's just some points.
Specifically.
This is the article. It starts at the top.
I just know it's the same one that I have.
Yeah.
Alright, running through.
Are you done with my laptop?
Yeah, stop, bro. We're at 1:45. Actually, I'm just gonna stay here. Okay. So, just as a roadmap, Judge, I'm going to start on their long-term stuff, and then I'm actually going to respond to some of the things that they made on our case, and then back down the negative. So,
Wait, so you're starting with the observation?
yeah, I'm gonna start with your observation. So it's gonna go neg, af, neg. Robert, are you good?
Yes.
Good over here?
Whenever you are.
Okay. Judge? Okay. They say that long term is the biggest impact in the round because we're going to have to try and solve the conflict, but they don't give a way to actually solve the conflict. That's going to be really critical because the only true way to stop this civil war is to get Assad out of power that they certainly cannot advocate for. That's why the terminalized impact that we should look towards in the round is lives. Whoever can save the most lives should win the round. That being said, let's get into what they said on our case, right? So the first response was basically saying like an overview that we weren't topical in any way, right? But their own definition about how we have to provide safety and grant asylum is going to be really critical because that safety, that part of that definition is what's going to happen through these legal channels. We create these legal channels and that in turn is going to allow refugees to have a safer environment. That's still acceptance, that's going to be really critical. But then on to the specifics. They talk about how camps are bad and they talk about how fishermen are like disguising themselves. The problem with this is that they ignore the Robbins evidence, which very clearly indicates that it's the reasons to why the smuggling became this $26 billion or whatever number he said, like industry that it was, is because of these restricted borders, because people couldn't get across. But opening up these legal channels is going to diminish this, even if it's expensive now. Even if there's going to be like some sort of like continuation, there's still going to be a rollback which is sufficient enough to affirm. Then they talk about how like Austria closed their borders, but this happened in the world in negative. This is going to be really, really important because this argument just simply isn't unique at all. Recognize that these things are happening in the status quo, but in the world of pro, these things will change because we're forcing these states to actually open up their borders. Their response on camps was like talking about this Bender evidence, right? They talk about 37,000, but here's the big problem. The next line says, while most of these refugee returners were people from Balkan countries who, quote, face little chance of being granted asylum. They're going back because they face little chance of actually being accepted. We accept them and they stay. Let's get into the specifics of their case. Their first argument talks about how this is like, it's basically brain drain, right? First, this isn't unique. This is happening in the world of the con. There's no way to quantify it. There's no way to weigh it. Then they talk about the future of Syria, right? But first, recognize that it's really silly to believe that everyone who's smart in Syria is just going to leave. That doesn't make a lot of sense. But then you can turn. But then next, the Boston Globe actually explains that the future of Syria also works with people not necessarily from Syria. They cite that things are like the other people are coming from NGOs and other people are coming from the UN. So you don't necessarily need this large influx of Syrians like they talk about. But then they read this Pollock evidence and they read about like developing. They essentially say that terrorism is still going to grow, right? Recognize that Assad is the real problem here, not necessarily the refugees. The terrorism that's being sparked from the civil war is because of the civil war that Assad started, not because of the influx of refugees. Now, let's get to the contention 2 that talks about backlash. Right off the bat, recognize that they're essentially asking you to negate because racism, right? Like, because racism is bad and xenophobia is bad. But they don't actually give you uniqueness here. They certainly don't show you a bright line as to how many refugees also are going to increase the amount of xenophobia. They certainly can't tell you how much is going to go up in the world of pro, which is really critical because saving lives is much more important than the xenophobic actions that they talk about. But then let's get to the specifics. Their subpoint A talks about how there's like the right wing are already in power, but the United Nations explains that education is an essential way to like make sure people aren't like deeply rooted in discrimination. That's going to be really, really critical because the only way to educate these people is to like put them into a society where they are integrated, put them into a society where they're forced to deal with these sort of racist, this sort of racial structures, so that we can in turn break them down. Their subpoint B talks about oppression, right? Recognize that there's always backlash whenever new people come to a country. It happened every time like Irish or other immigrants came to the United States. There's no sense in believing that it's not gonna come true. But this is where we do some impact analysis because it's either these refugees that are being put under oppression, or they're being placed, or they're putting back into Syria where their lives are at risk. At that point, we show you that they want to stay. But more importantly, on their subpoint C, they talk about radicalization. But the Chicago Tribune explains that European radicals in power are actually losing their grasp on anti-immigration rhetoric, and it's becoming far less important. Which means in the long term, this xenophobia and radicalization that they talk about goes away.
Are you ready for crossfire?
Sure.
Can I have the first question?
Mm-hmm.
So when you open up legal channels, are you just like, are you just opening up the borders for EU countries?
Well, that's part of it, right? So like, okay, so where do most refugees want to go? Germany, right?
Well, I mean, I'm sure they just want to leave Syria, go somewhere. I don't know.
Okay, that's fine. But the majority of them are going to Germany because their borders are more open, right? Angela Merkel.
Well, actually, Angela Merkel has started like turning away migrants at the border.
Wait, you're not answering my question, right? So like, that's where they want to go.
Claim.
Wait.
Okay, but my question is, what does it mean to open up legal channels? That's all I want to know.
Okay, it means two things. One, it means like taking away these policies that you talk about from like Denmark or wherever it was from, Denmark, right?
Austria, close
Austria.
borders.
Okay, Austria. So it means also take apart, like, okay, so it's establishing ways for these people to travel from Syria to, like, the European
What
Union.
is that? Yeah, what does that mean? Like, that's not a legal channel. That sounds like a physical, geographical, like, what is it, like, transports, or the illegal channel sounds to me like making it easier for migration and, like, actually, like, legally opening up a border. So what is a legal channel?
Right, it's both of those things, right? The strengthening policy that the European Union has
Right,
is
that's
strictly
for- that's for,
I know,
like-
it's strictly for the people, the citizens there, right?
Sure.
Essentially, it's a policy like that for refugees. I have a
So
question.
once,
Wait, wait.
so it's a policy that where refugees, once they get to the EU, they can travel freely between the EU?
It's twofold. It's that, and it's also these legal transportation methods that we talk about. So
Okay.
let's talk about backlash, right?
Yeah, sure.
So what happens in the world of pro? How much does backlash increase?
Okay, it's going to increase, first of all, when you're talking about a macro political trend, if either side brings up a statistic, it's probably falsified because you can't say 1% increase in refugees means 50% increase in radical nationalism.
Right, I agree.
What it means is just now with a small influx of refugees, what we're seeing is just by using anti-immigration as their platform, right-wing radical nationalist parties rise to power. And this isn't just like, if this was just people were getting mad, we would say, fine, that's just racism, nobody cares about that. But the point is, they're implementing oppressive and discriminatory policies and relegating them to slums, which have conditions pretty much similar to what they're escaping, and that breeds and fosters terrorism. It's the same as a refugee camp, as well as the fact that, like, even if you don't buy all that, they'll probably just be put into more refugee camps in Europe as well.
Okay.
So that's what our radical.
so-
that's what our
right.
whole.
So you cite someone who, like, gained some seats in some country, right?
It's not just okay. Look, like I listed 7 countries all over Europe that have been seeing this rise. Like, I'm sure you could bring that up and say, oh, it's just a few racists getting pissed at some Syrians.
No,
if it
what
was
I was
happening
going
in
to say
one
was that
country.
the
But the fact
Slavic
is, this is a
minister,
trend.
the port, like in Portugal, also there were countries who were also conversely losing power because they want to be right wing. Right? Does that make sense?
Which, the point that I'm trying to make is these 7 countries are already seeing, just with a small influx of refugees, they're starting to close their borders and implement policies that would oppress them, and it's only going to get worse if we start accepting substantially more.
We're gonna run a little bit of prep. Alright. Okay, so opponents, you ready?
How much from Taylor?
54 seconds. You ready? Gore?
Yep.
Judge? Alright, so I'm gonna start with the little topicality overview and then go down the neg and make extensions of offense. So, opponents, you ready? Well, I just did that, my bad. Alright. Let's begin with topicality. They don't actually answer this, right? They just say, oh, we need to provide them safety. You can do that in refugee camps. That's how it's done in the status quo. That's how the UN says you do it. That's what's going to happen. So they trigger their own impacts on contention too in the app world because you're just going to be relegating countries to camps. But they say, oh, we're going to break down this paradigm. We're going to fiat political mindsets. We're going to change all of Europe to one big happy family that accepts refugees. That's not going to happen. The status quo influx of refugees shows an increase in nationalism. The app world will only make it worse. Like Gorov said, you can't put a number on nationalism, but what you can't put a number on is discriminatory policies. That comes in at subpoint B. That was completely unanswered in the rebuttal. Extend that as clean offense. That's voter number 1 for the neg right now. You can sign your ballot. But let's move on to the attacks placed on case, right? They say we don't solve the conflict, but they horribly mishandle the warrants that come from our contention 1. That's the conflict solvency, so let's get into that, right? They try to oversimplify it with this brain drain argument. It's not a brain drain argument. The McHugh card ties directly into Cambanis and Cameron that say educated Syrians are necessary for the plan to rebuild Syria. And then Pollock, our solvency advocate, tells you that the rebuilding plan has empirically worked in the past, and that's how you're going to solve the conflict. They say that solving Assad is the problem with terror. We agree, right? But we give you a way to solve the problem. The Anbar awakening in Iraq happened. What we did is we used developmental aid in the Anbar province to stop al-Qaeda from growing in Iraq. They were eradicated from Iraq and then showed up in Syria because of the civil war, right? We can do that again now, and we can stop the conflict. We can stop the influx of refugees. We don't trigger any of the impacts we see from backlash. We don't trigger trigger any of the harms from camps, and then you vote neg right now. It's really, really easy, Judge. They've horribly mishandled these warrants. Don't buy any of them. And then let's move on to their attacks on backlash, right? First, they say that there's like no uniqueness to backlash, but what we show you is there's backlash without a substantial increase. You're only going to see more right-wing nationalism. There's been a macro political trend that shows that there's going to be discrimination, there's going to be backlash, it's going to happen. You can't put a bright line or a number on right-wing, like, pissed off racist people. Like, that doesn't exist, right? So, and then they say that education is key to solving racism, and you do this through integration, but remember the argument we made on subpoint C is that you don't see integration when they're accepted, they're relegated to slums, you're not going to get any of their solvency. Vote neg.
We have 137, is that what you got?
We didn't keep your prep, like,
Oh, okay.
whatever you say you have, like, I trust you.
Alright,
No biggie.
so we have 137 starting now.
Okay, look.
No, that 1 second, so yeah.
Alright, sweet.
Judge, just for your benefit, a little roadmap. I'm going to start on how you want to frame today's, like, weight today's round. That makes most sense in the affirmative. Then going down the negative case, back why you vote for the affirmative. So to clarify, after negative. Okay. Carlos, are you good? Kingwood? And Judge. Okay. This round ended last speech when they cold conceded lives. We've already, every speech we tell you lives are the most important factor. Not only do they drop lives, but they drop the long-term conflict observation they mentioned. But going on the negative case, their first contention talks about, like, basically what they say is the rich are leaving Syria and going to, like, Europe and they can't work. The hugest problem here is what Carl says. It goes cold conceded from the Boston Globe. They say that NGOs and the UN can solve for this. It's not unique. We can have, in the pro world, we can have the problem they're mentioning. You drop the first contention on face off that. But more importantly, it's on the second contention. The biggest argument today's round we can all agree on is xenophobia. But do not let racism and xenophobia prevent saving lives. If we did so, we'd still have African Americans in chains right now. That's what happened if you advocate for the con, you say xenophobia. Same thing happened to Syrians. Let Syrians be integrated through the open border policy. And Clean Lakes and Chicago Tribune, they completely dropped it. We answered the response. The Chicago Tribune says the Slavic Prime Minister is losing power. He lost his legislative majority. The right wing is not growing. That analysis was from a month ago. Their analysis from a year ago. Compare the analysis after the round if you want to. But moving on to the affirmative flow and why you vote for us is because we save lives in two key ways. First, through smuggling. What we tell you from the United Nations is there's no alternative to smuggling. These lives will be in danger, and lives how you vote. They respond by saying simply xenophobia. But remember, Clean Lakes and Chicago Tribune still, because xenophobia is not like the right wing first is not dropping, and secondly, to combat xenophobia, we have to be integrating. They'll say slums, but I'll respond to that later. Then the IMO tells you that 70% of migrants travel by sea, and those lives are lost because of illegal smuggling. Save 70% of lives, vote affirmative. You have to wait around through lives, so it only makes sense to go affirmative. But the second way we went through lives is through camps. Their only response was slums. This is really critical because at the very top, they read the UNHCR definition. And that definition says resettlement and says education. Education means integration. Their definition only helps us. That's really critical because when Bex tells you about the isolated camps, they completely cold concede the disease point we made. When disease happens because of the camps, more disease spreads, lives are lost, not only refugees, but the people. Do not let them try to respond to the final focus. If you care about lives, you will always vote for the affirmative every time. For these reasons, Carl and I are very proud to affirm.
Okay, so by ending conflict, do we save lives?
You have not proven that you're going to end this conflict.
Okay, what about the solvency advocate that literally came out of contention 1 that said developmental aid worked in the past, developmental aid exists in the neg world, and doesn't link to political backlash?
Basically what we say is, even let's just say the conflict's still in, right?
Hold on.
It
no,
goes,
we're,
wait.
no, we're saying conflict is ended.
No,
Conflict
no,
is not still
okay, I'm
ended.
talking about the round. Just give me a second to explain. Because you keep talking, I can't explain. So, what happens basically is, let's talk about the conflict, right? It happens in both the pro and the con because it's non-unique. We can have GMOs in the pro.
Hold on, back up. The exclusivity comes when developmental aid doesn't link to political backlash and discrimination against refugees.
Wait, but we
That's
also,
completely dropping-
okay, hold on, wait. On your contention too, we also told you that it's non-unique because by your own standard, it's happening in the world of con, right?
It's
right.
happening
it
at
gets
this
worse
level right
in a
now.
substantial
Exactly.
increase. Right. So when you stop the flow of refugees, it doesn't happen in the con, and it doesn't get any worse like it will in the pro world.
Okay,
right?
so my question for you
Wait, why won't it get any worse?
Because there's no refugees.
Wait, you're not letting refugees come in.
No, we're solving the conflict because there's no refugees leaving Syria. That's where the developmental aid comes in.
Wait, so I have a
Because
question
what
for you,
we're
Joe.
trying to avoid is a downward spiral where we accept more and more refugees, which leads to more and more conflict, and then 5 years down the line, this will be another
Okay,
debate.
so I have a
So
question
just
for you.
solve
That's
it.
why we're saying, and we have the one empirical example of actually being able to solve conflict in the Middle East through the type of developmental aid that we talk about.
Wait, the
Anbari
Anbar province,
Awakening,
right? The Anbar
Yeah.
province, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Didn't we also have troops there when this happened?
No, we pulled them out, and then we also.
Wait,
like-
when did the Anbar Awakening happen?
I think it was
2007.
Yeah, 2007.
We definitely had troops there, didn't we?
We did not pull out
Give
like
me
20,
how many
30.
troops do we have in Iraq?
A lot, because it was in the middle of our invasion. The reason that happened was to try and fight back against
We,
Al Qaeda.
we
Okay,
realized
so-
troops don't work against Al Qaeda. We used developmental aid instead.
Wait,
there was a
I don't
change
think
in
the US ever
mindset
did
in
that.
Anbar.
Can I ask you a
Al
question?
Qaeda
Like,
left.
let's just move on.
That's what
Let's
happened.
move on from this. We don't like have a yelling match.
The last year.
You want to
So-
move on because like
No.
you don't want me to explain what
Wait,
happened because you
okay,
don't
no,
want
wait,
to
I'm
explain
not-
Then, then continue explaining, please.
what happened in Anbar. We had troops. Troops weren't working to eliminate Al Qaeda. Developmental aid came in. Developmental
where?
aid made the U.S. developmental aid,
I don't
right?
know.
Hold on.
Do you want the
Keep
evidence
going,
for it?
just keep
Like
going.
developmental aid changed Anbar. Al Qaeda leaves. Al Qaeda only comes back because of more conflict in Syria.
Okay, wait, so
If we
did our
just-
troops just leave? Because you're missing a pretty critical part. Did our troops just leave? Like I think
Did
that
the
you're
troops
telling the
stay?
narrative of like the Anbar province
The
incorrectly.
point is, the troops aren't what solved the problem. Like,
The
I
developmental
we
aid
have
solved
all
it.
the
They
evidence
worsened it.
pulled up right now. They worked together with the Anbari tribes, and they
Right, the
tried to
Sunni
rebuild the
tribes-
culture. They tried to rebuild it socially, politically, economically, exactly like what we're advocating for. In fact, we have a specific example to Syria by rebuilding the
Okay,
industrial
so
center
speaking of specific
Aleppo.
examples, where are your second contention about slums? Because I read the evidence, and I would love for everyone to like read the evidence out loud. It doesn't say refugees, because I read the evidence. It says immigrants 50 years ago from French African colonies.
Hold on,
So
how
where's this like why are the slums refugee specific? Because if you don't have that, you can't
The
win your second contention.
discriminatory policies relegate them to these slums. We read that in the rest of the contention.
I'm gonna take the rest of my crap.
54 seconds left.
The roadmap is I'm just gonna be doing straight voters for the. Is everyone ready?
Yes.
We're still going to extend our observation 1 that solving the conflict is the best long-term solution because we on the com side don't believe that we should advocate for a downward spiral of more chaos and more violence, and then 5 years down the line there will be yet another refugee crisis, which is exactly what you will see by accepting more refugees. We are the only ones in this round that solve this because we have the empirical example, and then we also have the Anbar Awakening, which don't let them come up here and misconstrue it as being because of troops, because the actual success came from rebuilding the Anbar province socially, politically, culturally, culturally, and economically. And then we have the specific examples which come from the Cameron 16 card. For example, rebuilding the industrial center of Aleppo. We solve for that best. That means you can vote con right now. But say you buy into their framework of saving lives, which is very noble, and we can still win under that. First, they actually perpetuate the conflict. You can cross-apply our McHugh 15 card, which with data compiled from the UN and other humanitarian aid organizations. Most of the people leaving are wealthy upper middle class. This isn't a brain drain argument, it's more nuanced than that. Because the Pollock 16 card comes in and plays into that when these people leave, it actually leads to an increase in instability, and that sort of instability is exactly what these type of civil wars thrive upon. So when you keep on taking more and more refugees, you're actually making the conflict worse. The second reason is, say you do accept all of these refugees, they still get put into refugee camps. The Bender evidence still applies because what it says is that there are these refugee camps in Germany and they're still being forced into refugee camps. Say you don't buy any of that and you are accepting refugees and they come out of refugee camps. Well, then you can cross-apply all of our contention too, which says that all this leads to, from the current macro-political trend that we see in 7 countries that I listed all across Europe, is more oppression and more discrimination against refugees. This isn't just us getting angry about a few races. This is us having very concrete fears, because with the current trend with the small influx of refugees, the AF will only perpetuate this, and what this leads to is that once you take them out of refugee camps, their idea of integration is they'll just be relegated to they'll just be relegated to these satellite slums, which have been where all of the terror attacks in Europe have come from, which I brought up in rebuttal and they never answered, and also where most of Belgium's terror activity comes from. So regardless of how you take it, this round is a clear con ballot.
You know what? Run that 1 second of prep.
Let's take a sip of water, I guess. Okay, so just as a roadmap, I'm gonna touch on what he just said. Actually, sorry. I'm gonna start with lives, touch on what he said, and then smuggling and camps. Robert, good?
Yes.
Good over here?
Whenever you are.
Judge? Okay. We all agree lives is the most important, right? But they don't actually solve the conflict, right? Let's talk about the way that they say that they solve, right? They say that they solve through the future of Syria, and then they read this Pollock analysis that says that it worked really, really well in Anbar. 2 big problems that we've tried to establish. Remember that the Anbar province was troops. They were reorganizing the tribes. But then they go up here in the final focus, and they say, well, the real success was after. The reasons to why it was successful after was because Al-Qaeda was gone. The problem with this scenario is, well, Assad is not going to leave. He's not gone. No one's taking him out. At that point, they have no solvency. We've made that pretty clear. But even if that's true, even if you believe that, right, we still access this in the world of the pro, because as the Boston Globe, which Robert extends in the last speech, tells you that these things are also going to happen, because it's not just people in Syria, it's also the United Nations and NGOs. But then they talk about backlash, and here's where they try to put all their eggs in one basket. Essentially, they're telling you that we shouldn't, try and fight racism because we're racist now. And that's going to be really problematic, not only because we outweigh with lives, but more importantly, because the Chicago Tribune that Robert also extends, that says that at the end of the day, the Slavic prime minister is still losing seats, right? So what we're seeing is that in the long term, people stop caring about the refugees in terms of xenophobia, and they start caring more about domestic policies again, which means the xenophobia is going away in the long term. That being said, even though that links to their framework, we're going to win on lives, right? We're going to win on smuggling. Because what we tell you essentially is that what's happening is that these illegal channels are being used, the profitable business is being taken because of the lack of open borders in the world of the con. Essentially, that's going to continue to happen. And in Crossfire, they try to tell you that, well, we want to make sure that no xenophobia happens, so we're just going to stop the refugee flow. That's never going to happen. That's going to increase smuggling even more. In the world of the con, all of our impacts are exacerbated. So at this point, it's very clear who's winning on lives, because people will continue taking rickety boats. People will continue being put in these terrible trucks, and they're going to be taken through smugglers. In the world of the pro, that changes. In the world of the pro, that doesn't happen anymore, and that's the clearest link to lives. That's why the IMO tells you that the people who are dying by the sea, we can save 70% of the people who die in terms of traveling are dying by the sea. Prevent that from happening and affirm the resolution.
Well done. Good round.
Well done.
Good work. Good work.